I'm feeling a little punchy. I should probably not live stream. Nate G, 1,000 Pine Points. Thanks for being here first. I appreciate it. Good to see you, Joy. Hey, Shannon. Good to see you here. Hi, Floyd. Jim Harris. First time I've been here on the live stream. Well, welcome, Jim Harris. Let me introduce the gentleman on the screen. The big guy and the big... He's not big physically. He's just big... You know what I mean. John from What Do You Meme? He's a YouTuber, Christian. Braxton Hunter, the bald guy on top. He's Trinity. I'm doing this because I want to support apologetics. They need your support. They need your money. They need your money. And then we have Cameron Bertuzzi, whose channel is called Capturing Christianity. And then at the bottom, we have Mike Winger. His YouTube channel is called Mike Winger. And they critiqued a video that genetically modified skeptic did on, his name is Drew, on the problem of evil. And so we'll get to that. Why did I call this live stream Heaven Better Be Real? Because if it isn't, I tell you, Christians should be pitied for for what they believe, because this whole argument about the problem of evil and suffering basically boils down to, well, it's going to be amended, it's going to be paid back, it's going to be a net benefit in the end because of eternity in heaven. But I would like to remind Christians, I like to find points of agreement, and where we agree, if I enter your worldview, I think everybody on the planet can see the logic of this. If Yahweh created nothing, if he created absolutely nothing, is that possible to create nothing? Just if he didn't create, would there be sin? No. Would there be evil? No. Would there be pain? No. Would there be suffering? No. But he did create, right? So Yahweh, the buck stops at the top, at least in corporations in the United States. So the buck stops at the top, even with Yahweh. And so he's at least a little bit culpable, maybe just a scotch, maybe, yes. But I know that it's bothersome for Christians to admit that. I want to make another point that guys, like I'm showing on the screen here, they talk about atheists a lot. What percentage of the United States, what percentage of the world are atheists? What is it, 3%, 4%? I came up with this idea, but Apologia actually refined it better. What was the saying? And you'll see exactly where this is going. For people who don't believe in atheism, they sure talk about atheists a lot. Why are these gentlemen so terrified of atheists? Or, that's the wrong word. Why do they feel the need to address it? And my guess is, guys like Drew, who we'll see shortly, if you're not familiar with Drew from Genetically Modified Skeptic, he's calm. He appears kind and compassionate. He doesn't swear. He's not loud. He doesn't have a temper. He seems like every Christian woman's dream of a son-in-law. And that is a powerful combination when you got that type of person in front of the camera talking calmly and making a lot of good points. And then the Christians go, and I'd bet, and I am a betting man, I bet that at least one of these guys got a few emails, or all of them, saying, can you please do a critique video on this Drew guy, this genetically modified skeptic guy, because like he's causing me to doubt. And what's the problem with doubting in Christianity? There's a lot at stake. And you'll hear Mike Winger say that. There's so much at stake. What's at stake? Well, it's not just here on earth that's what's at stake. It is eternity. Heaven and hell, carrots and sticks. And you're going to hear that theme of carrots and sticks, especially from Mike Winger, a couple of times as we play this. So I'm not going to play the whole thing because it is just... it would be too long. But I'm going to start it somewhere just past middle. It's like 40 on the original video, which I linked in the description box. It's at 47:06. And it's when John starts talking about the rebuttals to animal suffering and so forth. And the first part, I think, was mostly made up of Mike Winger talking about Pascal's wager. And so I just skipped all by that. And we'll start with animal suffering.
I'm sorry, John.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, yeah. These will be
46
faster.
minutes
That's
in
fine.
so far. All right.
Then,
Okay, yeah,
for
no
a
problem.
long period in history, he demanded humans to slaughter and sacrifice animals to him just because he enjoyed the act of devotion.
Okay, and then obviously, just real quick, anybody that's ever read the Bible knows that that's just false, right? And so, out of charity,
Anybody who have read the Bible, just know that's false.
I'm just going to assume that it's just ignorance here, where he just, isn't familiar with the Bible.
He isn't familiar with the Bible. I bet you Drew is very, very familiar with the Bible. I'm just guessing here, but that's probably a good guess. Why is it that guys like John pull a William Lane Craig on guys like Drew? It's like, well, it's obvious he's ignorant. Like if he makes that type of comment, it's obvious he just hasn't read the Bible. Boom, dismiss Drew, dismiss genetically modified skeptic, just dismiss him because he hasn't read the Bible. He doesn't even know what he's critiquing. This is what William Lane Craig pulled on Apologia, and this is what John is trying to pull here. I would love to set up a Bible quiz between John and Drew, but maybe he would say, well, I'm more familiar with the philosophically minded stuff, so I could beat Drew in that type of quiz show. Yeah, let me rewind this. This is important.
Just real quick, anybody that's ever read the Bible knows that that's just false.
In history, he demanded humans to slaughter and sacrifice animals to him just because he enjoyed the act of devotion.
Now, Drew probably shouldn't have said just because, but does God not like devotion? Does God not love devotion? He loves devotion. Isn't that biblical? Isn't devotion a word to describe love and loyalty through the acts of his creation? And how does one atone in the Old Testament? It was through sacrifice. How does one show love to Yahweh in the Old Testament? Well, it's through repentance. And how did they repent back then? Well, they did it through sacrifice. Drew is absolutely right here.
Okay, and then obviously, just real quick, anybody that's ever read the Bible knows that that's just false, right? And so, out of charity, I'm just going to assume that it's just ignorance here, where he just, isn't familiar with the Bible. But in the Old Testament, the reason why people sacrificed animals was to atone for the things that they did wrong. That was the purpose of it. And so this was an act of mercy on God's part.
An act of mercy. It was an act from the people to get forgiveness of sins, to have their sins atoned for. It was their act out of love and devotion that God, Yahweh, demanded.
And so it's not because he enjoyed it, as Drew said. And
it's not because he enjoyed it?
We can keep going, Mike.
It's not because Yahweh enjoyed it, as Drew said? Thus saith the Lord. Turn your Bibles, will you, everybody in the pews, if you're listening, open up your Bibles to Leviticus 1-4 or your smartphones. And this is chapters 1 through 4. And what I did is I just did a search on the word odor as in the context of sacrifices. There's sacrifices, burnt bloody meat. Bloody meat gives off an odor. And if you look at Leviticus 1-4, now remember, John just said that, it's not because God loved, sacrifices. Well, he did love the odor that sacrifices gave off, and the priest shall burn the whole altar, and as a burnt offering and an offering by fire, a pleasing odor to the Lord. And it says this over and over again, a pleasing odor to the Lord. A pleasing odor to the Lord. God, Jesus, Yahweh and Jesus love the smell of burnt meat. A pleasing, or is this just a figure of speech? A pleasing odor to the Lord. A pleasing odor to the Lord. There's another one in Genesis. Let me see. Genesis 8. Wasn't God pleased with the sacrifice of Jesus? Was Jesus' sacrifice a pleasing odor to him as well? Genesis 8, verse 21. So it's not just in Leviticus. We got, and when the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, the Lord said in his heart, God, the Lord said in his heart? What version is this? This is RSV. First of all, does God have a nose? Or is it, actually, open theists might say yes. Does God have a heart? I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again destroy every living creature. So it seems like God does like certain smells, even if it's a figure of speech. He still loves it.
Alrighty.
Or is pleased with it.
Of course, there's another explanation for this issue. Maybe God had nothing to do with the formation of the food chain, and humans just made up a myth that morally justified killing animals so they could keep doing it without internal moral conflict.
Yes, that I'm going to skip ahead, but to me that's the what's more likely question, right? What's more likely, that there's a real God out there who set up the system that wants animals to be placed on a piece of wood or rocks, and then wants to light it up, and it has to be bloody meat, and that this God is pleased with the aroma that's given off, and that atones for all the bad stuff you did in the past. What's more likely, that that's true, or that humans came up with this as a way to justify and feel good about what they believe, and to maybe hope that rain will come so they'll get crops, and maybe hope that their kids won't get sick, that it'll appease the gods? Is it that much different than the cultures around them at the time? Okay, I'm going to skip ahead to 4908. Again, I want to try to keep this not too long.
This direct encouragement of the suffering of the innocent is entirely inconsistent with a tri-omni nature. If God couldn't create a food cycle for all creatures that didn't include suffering, then he isn't omnipotent. If he didn't know the system would lead to suffering, he isn't omniscient. Now, if he could have done better, if he could have made a food cycle that didn't promote suffering, but chose not to, he's not only lacking in omnibenevolence, but I would argue he's a sadist.
Yeah, so pretty strong words right there, right? So, all right, so first off, this is what kind of reveals to me more that Drew probably isn't familiar with the biblical literature, because
Drew is not familiar with the biblical literature. We just heard John say, well, it's obvious that Drew hasn't read the Bible. I'm going to give him some charity and just assume he's ignorant. And here it's obvious that Drew just is not familiar with the biblical literature on this. If only he was well read in apologetics, then he would clearly not say the things he's saying.
Because it seems to ignore the fact that God did create a food cycle that didn't include suffering, right? We all know this. And then the fall happened. And then that's what changed the world. The world was initially created with harmony. And so in Genesis 1, actually, verse 28, start at 28 and we can go to 30. Actually, we can just start at...
Now, the question here is, the point that Drew is bringing out here is, okay, pretend there's no humans. We have this reality of animals killing other animals and eating each other, a lot of times while they're still alive, and that animals get cancer and animals have pain, and yet animals don't have free will. Animals don't go to heaven. There's not morally sufficient reasons for, at least in the afterlife, for this type of suffering that these animals have to go through. So what's the deal with animals? And so this is John trying to explain that.
29, sorry. It says, and God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And then verse 30, and every beast on the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. Right. So initially, yes, we weren't set up to eat animals. Right. And so this is a result of the fall.
This is the reason why we eat meat. The reason why animals eat meat is because of the fall as described in Genesis. This is why, how should I say this delicately? This is why educated Christians are leaving Christianity, or at least this type of Christianity right here, because of this type of thing. To say that lions and tigers used to eat lettuce and berries? Really? Come on? Is that what you're saying, John? Like, John must be a young Earth creationist, I'm assuming, or maybe an old Earth something, but believes that this is a literal something that happened. Like, John, do you believe we could take a video recorder or a smartphone and videotape lions eating vegetables in the past? Do you really, really believe that? Please, I beg of you, talk to your Christian friends from biologos.org, and maybe they can help you with this. But it's clear to me that you don't believe in common descent. You reject probably most of evolution. And you're saying that the original intention of Yahweh was for both humans and animals to eat just vegetables and fruits, not eat meat. You know that, I just thought of something. You know how the argument for heterosexual marriage between one man and one woman, they'll point to Genesis, just like John did. And they'll say, see, God's original intention was for one man, one woman. Okay, that's from the Garden of Eden, right? Before the fall, one man, one woman. But John just said that the original intention for food was vegetables and fruits. So if you're going to be consistent Christians and say, well, marriage is one man, one woman, because that's the original intent of Yahweh. The original intent of Yahweh is to eat fruits and vegetables. Yeah, I hear you now. I hear you saying, well, but later on, God said you can eat meat. So, okay, I'll give you a pass on that one. But maybe here, if you're a Christian vegetarian, you can use what I just said. Maybe that might work for you.
Right. And so, and also too, what I say really quick is that Drew seems to assume that the purpose of God creating life on earth is for us to be pain-free, but that's obviously not the reason why God created the pain, or created the us on earth, right? That is a good thing, but there's more important things that are more eternal as well, not just temporal and, you know, deeper and that sort of thing. But I'm trying not to take up too much time.
There's the carrots and sticks.
So the last point I just want to say real quick on that note is that Drew seems to, I think, like a lot of atheists tend to do this at least, is they try to assume that, or they seem to assume that this life is the only life. But if you're going to argue according to theology, then you also have to take eternity into the context and the equation as well. And because this world is fallen and broken, the next world will be pain-free. So that's something that I think he didn't consider. But if he's going to argue against this theologically, then he has to take all of theology into account as well.
Right. So we have, yes, even if you don't buy this whole idea that the fall and so forth, and there's pain and suffering here with animals and with humans, you got to keep in mind, atheists, that there's an afterlife and that there's heaven, and that will more than make up for it. Of course, if you're not one of God's chosen, or if you haven't accepted the gift of salvation through faith, then you're going to be in hell. But this gets back to carrots and sticks, and I want to pound this hard because Christians get offended when I say that Christianity is a religion of carrots and sticks, but really their own scriptures, well, John basically admitted this just now. James 4, verse 14, whereas you know, you do not know about tomorrow, what is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Christians, all of us humans, we're mists, right? That we're going to vanish in a little time. Earth is the doormat to the real party, which is the afterlife. So, Christians, what percentage of your life, your existence, is spent on earth? It's very, very little, right? 0.0000. You can't even put a number on it because heaven's for eternity. So when I say Christianity, religion about carrots and sticks, I mean it. It's about heaven and hell. Earth is but a mist. It's a vapor. It comes and it goes, and that is it. I want to keep that in mind as we go forwards.
Okay, now to
That is
the
a
last
huge
clip.
point. All right, here we go. Wait, this is number 5.
Of course, there's another explanation for this issue. Maybe God had nothing to do with the formation of the food chain, and humans just made up a myth that morally justified killing animals so they could keep doing it without internal moral conflict. Whether you're a believer in the Abrahamic God or not, you probably already know that people in many religions outside...
By the way, I just had to stop here. Look at this guy. He's cute. He's kind. He's like a little... You just want to hug him, right? Christian mothers, don't you want this guy as your son-in-law? But he's an atheist. This is what doesn't compute with these apologists. It's like, this has to be an act. He can't, he seems so nice, but he can't be because he's an atheist.
Side of yours tend to have doctrine that morally justifies actions which seem immoral, but allow that group to better survive or propagate.
Yeah, so right here, I'd say, like, correct me if I'm wrong here, but isn't that Drew's view of morality, right? Because in other videos and stuff, Drew talks about the morality, how morality has been explained by evolution, right? And so when he says that religious people made up things that allow the group to survive or propagate, that's exactly what morality is on his view, if I'm correct, right? And so if evolution gives us morality to help us survive and propagate, would that be a bad thing?
No.
If not, then why is it a bad thing when it comes to religion, right?
What Drew is doing is he's doing an internal critique, and he's saying, look, there's some frictions, there's inconsistencies here. Would we expect, if a God is a certain way, has a certain nature, like omnibenevolence, all kind, all loving, all merciful, and would we expect a God having certain attributes like all knowing, which open theists reject, and would we expect what we see if this God, the nature of this God is all powerful? Would we expect to see what we see? That's the bottom line of what Drew is saying here. If this God hates sin, and he can see what happens if he creates, and he says that the result of what he creates is sin, I hate sin, but I'm going to create what I know it's going to lead to, sin. I don't want anybody to perish, but I'm going to create what leads most to perish. At least in these guys' worldview, I think that's true. It's like, that is a problem. And I actually had a conversation with someone on Twitter today who admitted that. It is a problem. But it's like, where do I get my hope, meaning, and purpose if I don't have it? And that will come up later on in this video about, it's like, okay, atheists have these questions, but they don't have the answers to suffering. It's like, it's better to maybe to believe a myth and have comfort in suffering than not believe anything at all about God and afterlife and so forth. And you know what? Pragmatically, they might have a point. And I think this is why religion evolved in us Homo sapiens. It's to help us survive. I always give the example of my sister. My sister's alive today for only one reason, and that's because she's a Christian. And she put a feeding tube in her. She's totally paralyzed. She put a feeding tube in her because she believed that God was going to heal her of her MS. That's the reason she's alive today. Because she can't even really eat on her own anymore. But her faith, her belief in God is, so, evolution did a good job.
And then some people might say, well, religion doesn't allow it. It doesn't help us, survive and propagate. They'll say it's harmful. Well, if that's the case, then Drew would be wrong, right? When he talks about how these religious beliefs helped them to survive and propagate. But if he's right, and that is the case, then we'd have to throw away the very morality that Drew had to use in order to make his entire video a moral video, right? This throws away his entire foundation for his arguments if he's going to throw that out the window.
Is John's translator here? I'm not understanding what he's saying.
So that's what I say to that. Also, I'd say that, just a real quick note, because if religious people are making up excuses just to eat meat, then why is it that almost all non-religious people eat meat as well? What are their excuses then? What excuses are they making up, since they don't have religious excuses now to do what's so obviously immoral, as Drew seems to imply in that clip?
Again, I'm not exactly sure what John's talking about here. I think, well, here's my question. Was all the meat eaten that was sacrificed to Yahweh in the Old Testament? I don't think so. I think maybe just a bit of the leftovers, but if there was an offering to the Lord and it's burnt up, I think it's burnt up, unless you're going to eat charcoal. I don't know. Was Drew trying to imply that eating meat is wrong? I don't think so.
I was
at least not from what we heard.
Go ahead.
No, it just seems like completely made up with no evidence whatsoever. People made that up so they could eat meat. Anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's ridiculous. But also too, it's like, even if, so say if, example for Christianity, if it did make up stuff in order to propagate and flourish and all, like you said, then Christianity would have been the world's worst religion of all time and would have died out a long time ago, right?
Why would it have died out? Are you saying if Christianity is so bad, it would have died out? Okay, this is getting interesting.
Because Jesus tells you to pray for your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Paul says, don't curse them. And Peter, First Peter, it says,
oh yeah, I remember where this is going.
It says, to this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to who judges justly. And then he's talking about how we need to respond to people that harm us, right? So if Christianity really was like all these views and beliefs came because we're trying to, survive and propagate, then Christianity would be the world's worst religion in that regard, and it would have died out a long time ago.
I'm curious if John believes that if Islam should have died out a long time ago, or if Mormonism should have died out a long time ago. And they haven't died out, does that mean that they are in some way effective and good then, John?
Which is why we are like pacifists and stuff. Christianity, or the early Christians seem like pacifists because we don't read about them.
Oh, this is interesting. I think John views early Christianity as pacifism. John, I know a lot of Mennonite preachers. They can help you with that. If you want to join a Mennonite church, just let me know, and I can hook you up.
Hurting anybody else or retaliating for at least 300 years after Christ, So anyways, that's the last point I had.
Yeah, maybe the reason why Christianity didn't, they were pacifistic and didn't hurt anyone until like 300 years later is because they had no power. They had no means to hurt people. They were under the thumb of the Romans, right?
All right. Well, there's one little clip left here.
Okay. Mike Winger screws up here and plays the wrong clip, so I'm going to skip over that. I think that's the point where he messes up.
I think that animal suffering is actually a really difficult problem for Christianity, for perfect being theism more specific. Well, I guess more generally, actually. But I don't know. I think that it's a real serious problem that we need to take.
Watch Mike Winger's face here.
Seriously.
Why?
And
why do you say that?
Do what?
Cam, why do you say that? Why do you say that?
What?
Uh-huh.
Well, I think that there are proponents of the problem of evil, or at least the atheistic arguments from evil that are formula. I mean, I just talked about one earlier today on my channel where we laid out a specific version of the problem of evil, and I think they can be seen more poignantly.
Okay, now the cynic in me is saying that this disagreement. I shouldn't say this. The cynic in me is saying this disagreement between John and Cameron was planned, but that's being really cynical. That's, but if it wasn't, and if Cameron's being sincere here, which I guess he is, he's saying everything that John just said about why animal suffering is not a big deal against Christianity. Cameron's saying no. Animal suffering is a big problem because, look, they don't get an afterlife and they don't have free will and they're not us and yet God punished them like us and they suffer like us and sometimes even in worse ways.
When you talk about animal pain, because it does seem to involve unjustified pain and suffering, whether or not you want to call it suffering or pain or whatever it is, it's still a bad state of affairs.
Yes, it's still bad state of affairs. What John was trying to do earlier, he was trying to say that, they don't have psychological pain like humans do, so it's not the same. But still, it's a bad set of affairs. I agree with Cameron here. And the main difference between animals and us humans, I believe humans are animals, but special ones, is that there's no afterlife reward to make up for it, which John alluded to, I think, a couple of times. Animals don't get that. Maybe there's some Christians out there that believe their pet dog goes to heaven, but I think most Christians don't believe animals of all sorts go to heaven.
I think we are pretty much all agreed on that. If you see your dog in pain, that's still like a bad state of affairs. You'd rather that not happen. So the question is still like this pain and suffering, it does still.
Humble thinker, I saw your quote, open theists don't deny God's all-knowing. Yeah. They believe God can only know what that is, which is knowable, which is not the future.
Still seem to sort of conflict with theism. So all I'm saying is that I think we just need to take it seriously.
Yeah, and I'd say to that,
oh, go ahead, John.
Oh, no worries. I just said real quick, right? Yeah, to that, I'd say exactly what I said in the first section as well, too. It's anthropomorphic, actually, to assume that these animals are experiencing emotional pain in the same way that we are, right? And that the pain is not justified in a way, because I think that the pain receptors, like I said, the pain receptors that are in the animals is actually necessary for their survival as well, you know? And so especially if they're not experiencing the emotional aspect behind the pain, then I wouldn't say that the pain is bad in that same way. So that's all I'd say to that.
Yeah, but John says that Adam and Eve sinned, and this caused spiritual death and physical death, and this is where all the suffering and pain came from. But why in the world are animals a part of that? And the thought occurred to me, like, if animals weren't a part of that, how many animals would we have on this planet? They would have taken over. Yahweh would have had to made a new planet by now for the population growth, assuming they could reproduce and so forth.
I think that one of the most important points that John brought up is the idea that this isn't the end of the story on Christianity, and it is the end of the story on atheism. All the suffering that's going on, the problem is worse in one sense on atheism because it's a problem with no resolution, no solution, and no change.
No hope, right, Mike?
It also is a problem that doesn't make sense totally because all your irk against evil doesn't really seem to make any sense on atheism in the first
internal critique
place. So it's like, why do I have this problem? So I have a problem that I don't know where it comes from, and I have no solution for it on atheism, at least from my perspective. But
what's the guy's name? Yuri, Noah, someone in the chat help me. Sapiens, the book Sapiens. It's a really good book. I haven't read it, all of it. I don't think I've read one book from cover to cover. Not even the Bible. I'm sure I missed a few pages when I was a Christian, probably in Leviticus. But in Yuri, whatever his name is, in the book Sapiens, goes through exactly why we evolved the way we did, to share myths. And it's the shared myth that helps communities coalesce together. And so Drew's video is basically saying, look, Jews, like other religions around them at the time, they came up with their own religion that had similarities to the religions before them, some unique ideas, and this bound them together as a community, as a group, and this helped their survival. And so what is more likely, that that the problem of suffering is from the fall of certain people in the Garden of Eden, or that we evolved laboriously over millions of years, and animals and humans alike share in these pains and sufferings and so forth? It seems to me the latter is more likely. But as Mike pointed out, but there goes our hope. How do we deal with this pain, Doug? Well, the same way as you guys do, just without the God. You have consolidarity. You go to your friends and family, and sometimes I think maybe even mourning is easier for atheists than Christians, because we can really mourn. We don't have this false hope, in my opinion, that we're going to see our loved ones again in the afterlife. We can really let go.
But the thing that I think really matters is the problem of evil makes me think this can't be the full story. You know, if there's a God, he's got to do something about all this stuff.
He's got
to. And in Christianity, yeah, of course he is going to do something about this. And there's a huge emphasis in Christianity that we don't find in other religions, actually, that we find the resolution even with animals. The lion lays down with the lamb, you know, or the wolf and the lamb, excuse me. The wolf lays down with the lamb. That there's this like peace even amongst in the future, even amongst animals. And
you see what's going on here? Mike is saying that the pain and suffering, there's a resolution to it. And he's pointing to heaven, or the new earth, however you want to put it. But Mike is saying that even animals, there will be a resolution for them. So even if the animal suffering is a problem, the wolves will lie with the lambs. And so therefore there's a resolution to this.
That this is a problem that Christianity says is resolved in the fullness of the gospel of Christ. And I think that means there's a sense in which this makes me feel that Christianity makes even more sense to my intuitions because of that.
I think that Stephen Weichster makes a point, and this back out of all animal suffering, however you want to phrase that, like globally throughout history, if you take any one specific instance of animal suffering, we would not expect that we would be in a position to see overarching goods that might come out of that. Now, I can see how that might sound like a cop-out to some people, but one of the examples that's given often is if I go and look in my backyard, I don't see any worms, but I wouldn't expect that I would be in a position to see the worms that are there just by looking out my backyard. And so there are certain things that we would expect to see. I think the example that I've heard people give is if there was a second moon orbiting Earth right now, we would expect to be able to see that, right? We would be justified in thinking, I don't think that's there. It should be visible to our instruments or to my field of vision, perhaps.
All this talk that Braxton Hunter is saying is he's saying that there's a greater good to be had here. There's a reason for these things happening for animal suffering, for example, that there's morally sufficient reasons for animals to suffer the way they do because we just can't see why they need to do it. Well, in a way, I agree with them. It's maybe the circle of life. Things have to die so other things can live.
But if we're talking about like, are there worms in my backyard? Just because I don't see them glancing out my window doesn't mean they're not there. And when it comes to a single instance of animal suffering, I don't know that there's not some overarching good that might be there in the butterfly effect 100 years from now. And so that's referred to as the no-see-em principle. You no see them, so they're not there. But I think it's a relevant thing to bring up. We don't know what goods might come out of that. And you would have to be in a position to say something like, because I can't see the goods that might come out of a specific instance of animal suffering, there aren't any. And I don't think you're in a position to say that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I said earlier. It's the morally sufficient reasons argument for animal suffering. They just took what they use for humans and applied to animals, and problem solved.
Awesome. All right, well, we're going to go to the...
But the problem is, though, with humans and animals alike, if there's a morally sufficient reason for a really bad thing to happen, it has to be for that animal or human that didn't die, right? Because what is the reason why a child dies with bone cancer? It can't be for helping that child because that child's dead. What's the morally sufficient reason for that dog who dies of cancer? This can't be for that dog because that dog is dead. And there is no dog heaven, so they can't use the afterlife. So I'm not sure if what Braxton said actually helps him or not.
I think I would agree with that.
Cool. We're going to go to the last question right now. This one comes for Cam, and here's the clip.
If God is omnipotent, he knows out of all the people he creates who would choose to believe in him and follow him while on earth. He also supposedly doesn't want people to suffer and only wants people to believe in him and follow him. However, God allows people who choose him to suffer while on earth, and much worse, he creates people that he knows will not choose him while on earth, and those people end up suffering in hell. There's an inconsistency there. If he's actually omnibenevolent, why would he not exclusively create people who would choose to follow him if they were put on earth, and then send them directly to heaven, skipping the suffering of earth entirely? If your answer to this question is along the lines of having free will and the capacity to suffer is better than lacking free will and not suffering, then you've just hurt the case for your doctrine. That answer implies that the people who would be created in heaven would not have free will, and that people in heaven right now don't have free will. If a life with free will and suffering is better than one without free will or suffering, then that means that earth must be better than heaven. So free will can't be the answer to this question. We once again face the problem of evil. If God couldn't exclusively create people in heaven, he isn't omnipotent. If he didn't know his creation of humans on earth would lead to suffering, he isn't omniscient. If he could create people in heaven but won't, he isn't omnibenevolent. As always, though, there is another option. Maybe this idea of God is simply nonsensical. The truth is, the concept of a tri-omni God falls apart immediately under anything more than momentary consideration.
Okay, so Drew said a lot there. Let's see if I can sum it up. Basically, if God knows what people will choose, if God knows if some will be Christian, some will reject Christianity, why not just create the ones that he knows would choose him? And then take it a second step, why not just pluck them right into heaven and avoid the whole game of pain and suffering here on earth? And so I think that's the main thing. One thing that I would say against Drew here is not all forms of Christianity believe that God knows the future. And so I think even the Molinists would say, no, the Molinists they still have a problem. But the open theists would say, oh, God didn't know who would choose him. He was waiting to see who would choose him, because the definition of free will, libertarian free will, is that choice has not been made yet. So God doesn't know what hasn't been made. It doesn't exist. Just like God's omnipotence is limited, his omniscience is limited, and so therefore he didn't know. But most Christians don't believe that, I don't think. Most Christians believe that God does know the choices people make. So this is a great argument. Hey, why not just make people who would believe in him, who would freely choose him, just make those people and skip earth and go straight to heaven. So let's see what the four apologists have to say.
All right. So I wanted to make sure that that last part was in there. I'm going to talk about that right at the end of this. But so real quick, I think that what we can see here is that 3 out of 4 of these questions are really just versions of the problem of evil. The first one, we're talking about literature and how the writing of the Bible and different interpretations can lead to one type of suffering. And then in the third one, we're really focusing in on animal suffering. And then this last one, we're looking at suffering here on earth. Why didn't God just sort of create everyone in heaven? So really what we're doing is we're just looking at 3 different versions of the problem of evil. And you can separate these into 4 different questions, or really 3 different questions, because we're just talking about 3 right now. But I think it's important to note that 3 out of the 4, we can just sort of be lumped together. Another thing I like to point out on my channel a lot is that questions are not arguments. A lot of times you'll see atheists ask questions like, why didn't God do it this way? Why is this here? Why did the Holocaust happen? And these questions are often misinterpreted as arguments, when in reality, questions are not arguments.
Questions are not arguments. Whenever you hear this said by anybody on Capturing Christianity's channel, write this down. Jesus said, "But who do you say that I am?" And Capturing Christianity replies, "Questions aren't arguments."
Just asking a question, why didn't God prevent this, is not an argument that God doesn't exist. It doesn't follow at all.
Questions are a great technique that even, I think you believe, Cameron, that Jesus used probably more so than making arguments, of showing maybe the inconsistencies of a worldview, the absurdity of a worldview. And I think asking questions is much more effective for someone who's doxastically closed and more prevalent to defensiveness, instead of just saying, you're wrong, here's the argument, blah, 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 blah. You say, well, why do you believe that? Just view it as the Greg Koukl method.
And so you've actually got to put it in like a structured argument. I think he at least attempts to do that in this one. And so we're going to look a little bit more closely here. But I've got a video on my channel where I basically answer this question, why didn't...
Actually, I have a note here.
I think he at least attempts to do that in this one. And so we're going to look a little bit more closely here. But I've got a video on my channel.
Yeah, he said that you have to put these ideas in a structured argument. And I say, no, you don't. If a Christian is talking to a non-Christian, Cameron, seriously, do you think the conversation has to be in structured arguments with premises and conclusions the whole way through? Or even if it's a video response back and forth, someone's making a video, do you honestly believe that this is how normal human beings communicate, through structured arguments? Of course not. When this is something I think a lot of Christians will resonate with. A powerful argument against abortion, which is not a structured argument, is just simply showing a picture of the baby in the 6-7 month stage. That will cause greater belief revision in a woman who's considering abortion than any structured syllogism can ever do. So maybe I should say that if you want to go for structured arguments, which are usually ineffective, then go ahead. But
kind of where I basically answer this question: why didn't God just sort of start everyone out in heaven? And so the basic overall goal of my response in that video was to identify different goods that can only be achieved in a world that basically starts out with non-heaven. And so I'm just going to give sort of 3 examples that are given in the literature and discussed by philosophers of goods that mean that it's better to have sort of an earth-heaven combination rather than just like heaven alone. So the first example of one of these goods is...
hey, he just said that earth and heaven is better than heaven alone?
Sort of an earth-heaven combination rather than just like heaven alone.
Okay, I got a question for you, Cameron. What is better, God and creation or just God alone? Think about it. What is better, God plus creation or God alone? See, this is a tough question for Christians to answer because they say, well, you can't get better than God alone. He's all loving. He's all perfect. He's all powerful. He's all merciful. He's all these things. He was all that before creation, was he not? How can you get better than God alone? And once you come to grasp with that, you can see the problems with your worldview. You're saying, well, he basically downgraded. He said, well, we got this world that's just me and 3 persons, of course. It's the best. But you know what? A little bit of sin is okay. I mean, I hate it, but if that's, I see it coming if I create free creatures. So yeah, just a little bit. Well, actually, it's going to be a lot of sin. Well, okay, a little bit of suffering is okay. Well, it's actually going to be a lot. But you know what? I'm willing to downgrade from my perfect world to a world of me and creation because you know what? That's just the way I am.
So the first example of one of these goods is love. And so basically being able to choose to enter into heaven is a great good. It's great to have that option to choose.
Being able to choose to go to heaven is a great good? Wait a minute. I guess we have to say bye to the Calvinists now. So if you're a Calvinist watching, you might as well just click off because I think you've lost your respect for Cameron Bertuzzi now. Calvinists don't believe you choose to go to heaven. And even Christians who do believe that you choose to go to heaven, where's the grace in that? Are you saying that Christians have the power to choose their own eternal destiny? And the reason why some go to heaven and some don't is because that power? Where's the grace in that?
Enter into heaven. And so you can think about it like this. So God is the opportunity to enter into a loving relationship with him rather than just like starting us out in heaven where we have no option but to love him.
We have no option but to love him in heaven? Is Cameron Bertuzzi admitting there's no free will to love God in heaven? What love is better? The free will love type or the forced love type? I think, Cameron, you would say the free will type, right? So is the love here on earth better than the love in heaven if you can't choose not to love in heaven?
And so that option is just in itself a great good. And you can think about it like, suppose that a mad scientist gave you like a love potion and they were like, you know, you can use this potion and make anyone that you come in contact with fall in love with you. And I think most of us, just thinking about it, you probably, I mean, it might be fun to like think about and fantasize about.
Cameron, I think, is sort of contradicting himself here. He's admitting that the free will love is better than forced love, but he said earlier that in heaven there's no option but to love Yahweh, but to love Jesus. You can't not love Jesus in heaven.
But it's not something that you would actually want to use. You wouldn't want to actually force someone to fall in love with you. Is that real love? So that's the first point.
Right. You want to give them an option not to love you, right? But is that the case in heaven?
Is that the option of being able to choose heaven is a great good, and you can't have that option if you just sort of start everyone out in heaven. The second example of a good that you can have when you have earth and heaven is the atoning work that Jesus did on the cross. And there's a Christian philosopher, his name is Alvin Plantinga. He has a theodicy, which is a reason that God would have to allow suffering on earth. It's a theodicy that's a really, really long name. It's called supralapsarianism. It's like the longest name that I've ever come across. Supralapsarianism. But the basic idea is that the incarnation and the atonement, what Jesus did on the cross, where he basically took our sins and basically made us right with God, what he did on the cross is one of the most incredible acts of love that we can even imagine. Okay, right? Sacrificing yourself for like your family.
Yeah, crucifixion is the best type of love you can imagine. Cameron, can you forgive someone without violence? These are simple questions that bother Christians up the yin-yang. Cameron, can you forgive me if I harm you without violence? If you answer yes, that's something you can do that your God can't. Your God demanded violence, did he not? Or are you saying that maybe forgiveness, atonement, could have been achieved without the cross? Are you willing to go that far? Could Jesus have died of a stroke, a massive stroke, and instantly died? The wages of sin is death. Jesus died. He was perfect. There's your atonement. Would that have worked? Massive stroke? Or did you need that bloody sacrifice? I think you would say, yeah. Well, I just read Leviticus. God loves, Yahweh loves the aroma of, I won't say that.
Or your friends or people who love you. That's a really great thing to do. But sacrificing yourself for people that hate you and want nothing to do with you and are sinning against you, like that act of love it's difficult to think, even just imagine a greater act of love than that. And so basically what we have in our world, where we have earth and heaven, that combination, is we have that world where Jesus gave himself and sacrificed himself for us. And that is only possible in a world that has sin.
Yeah, would this, what you just said, work, Cameron, 5 years before Jesus was born? Like, what would you have said 5 years before Jesus was born? Like, right now you're saying that all this sin and suffering it's being made up through the beautiful, loving atonement of Jesus on the cross, that the net benefit is there. But what would you have said 5 years before Jesus was even born? Like, I really think you're left with Judaism at that point, I think, which you're down to meat sacrifices, I guess.
All right, so the third example.
But by the way, Jesus' death and resurrection of the cross, the atonement, is a meat sacrifice. I want to point that out. Jesus' soul was not snuffed out when he died, just his body. But yet most Christians, I think all four that you're looking at here, would say that for the atonement to be sufficient, not just this, it can't be a spiritual resurrection. It has to be the death and resurrection of Jesus' body. It has to be a bodily resurrection. And what is the body? Remember, Jesus' spirit left the body, I think, right? Didn't stay in that little tomb. Jesus' body is a piece of meat, just like in the Old Testament, sacrifices were pieces of meat. Christianity is a religion about the death and resurrection of a piece of meat in order to achieve salvation.
And I'll quickly close this down, is what's called soul building. And this is my favorite theodicy. I talk about this a lot on my channel. Soul building is basically where you're put in a position where you can suffer or go through some kind of suffering, and that circumstance, that situation, provides the opportunity to grow your character in certain ways. And so I'm a big Marvel guy. I love watching the Marvel movies. In the first Thor movie, Thor was basically being an arrogant jerk, and he got banished to Earth. And so he was cut off from communication from his dad, his family, from everybody, and he was basically made mortal. So he underwent a lot of suffering. He was forced to go through suffering, but that suffering helped him realize sort of what he was taking for granted. And so suffering made him a better person, and eventually he was worthy to pick up his hammer and he beat all the bad guys.
Yeah, but what if Thor's suffering led him just to die? Can Thor die? I think he can, right? Yeah, his dad, Odin, died. So what good is it if, and that's the case for suffering for a lot of people, that what's the soul building for them if they, let's say, find out they have a disease and then 2 days later they're dead? Or I guess you can soul build for 2 days. No, they're in the midst of extreme suffering.
And so now, obviously, this is a movie, but there's a reason that writers tell these kinds of stories.
Oh, listen to this. Christians, listen to this one sentence by Cameron.
Obviously, this is a movie, but there's a reason that writers tell these kinds of stories.
There's a reason writers tell these types of stories. What type of stories? Stories that involve great amount of suffering and then overcoming that suffering. There's a reason authors write these type of stories. Does that remind you of the New Testament? There's a reason authors of the New Testament wrote these types of stories of Jesus' death and resurrection, because it builds a great story of hope, redemption.
It's because I think that acts of virtue through pain and suffering sort of resonate with us on a very deep level. But notice that these types of goods, where we're sacrifice, courage, compassion, forgiveness, these types of goods are only possible in a world that has suffering. And so
that means they're not possible in heaven. These overcoming the odds, showing compassion and showing forgiveness and showing courage. These are things that happen here on earth. They can't happen in heaven, can they?
in response to
Because there's no suffering in heaven.
this, Drew might say that this means that the earth is better than heaven. He even says that about free will. But I think that's actually a non sequitur. It doesn't logically follow at all. Just because some goods are only possible through suffering, that doesn't mean that all goods are possible through.
Right, but those goods are better on earth. The ones Drew pointed out, things like free will and being able to overcome suffering and character building and all that stuff. If there's no suffering in heaven, it's those goods that are absent in heaven, correct? Now, what Cameron's saying is, well, but then we got other goods to offset. We got your vending machines over there. We got your streets of gold over there. We got your mansions over there. We got other goods to overcome it.
Are only possible through suffering. And so a world that has heaven and earth, the combination, basically has the best of both worlds. And so basically what I've done.
Yeah, so he's saying because we have these unique character building type goods, it's the best of all worlds. But here's the problem, Cameron. We got two worlds. We got God alone and God and creation. God alone, God and creation. Which one's better? This one or this one? This one or this one? God alone has no sin. There's no pain, no suffering. God in creation has God as well, but has pain, sin, suffering, evil within your worldview. Which one's better? Which would you choose if you could consult God before the moment before creation?
As I've sketched three different reasons why God would create a world that has both. Another great one that you can look up if you're interested is called the Connection Building Theodicy by Robin Collins. And he's actually mainly known for his work on fine-tuning. But the basic idea is that virtuous responses to evil create valuable connections between people. So you build relationships with people, and these relationships can continue to grow in value over time. And it's only those through suffering where these connections are really built.
So is there friendships and connections growing over time in heaven? Like Cameron is painting a great picture of just how boring heaven's going to be.
And it's sort of an infinite, another one of these, these infinite value situation. Anyways, it's a really interesting idea. If you want to check that out, check out Robin Collins' work. Last thing to note here is that when he says maybe this idea of God, and he actually did this throughout pretty much the entire video, where he's like, here's the question, and he'll give like if God did this, then he's not omniscient, blah, blah, blah. And then he'll say, well, here's an option, or here's another alternative, or here's an easy explanation. But the point is that easy explanations are not necessarily good explanations. So you can have an easy explanation of why the dishes are in your sink. And you can say, well, the easy explanation is that aliens put them there. But that's not a good explanation.
Yeah, I agree with you, Cameron. Easy explanations are not necessarily good explanations. It reminds me of Judas falling headlong and that guy who debated Bart Ehrman saying, well, maybe he tripped on the way down when his noose broke and he tripped on something and then fell over. Yeah, easy explanations are not always good explanations. It reminds me of so much harmonization that I hear apologists do in the New Testament.
It's not enough to just come up with some explanation that you can think up off the top of your head, which is, I think, what mostly he's doing here is he's just thinking up an easy explanation.
No, he's not. Drew's not thinking of the top of the head. I'm sure Drew spends at least a couple hours preparing and scripting his videos.
Rather than doing the hard work of giving a good explanation. And so
now he's basically calling Drew lazy.
you can say that an omni-God falls apart immediately under anything more than momentary consideration. But I would just say, do more than a momentary consideration.
Yeah, and I did a word search on Drew's video, and he, of course, never used the word easy. The word easy is not to be found in his video. Okay, I want to skip this to the end. By the way, I honestly think that because Christianity is falling so fast in the United States, like it dropped like, I don't know, from 71 to 65% in 1 year. It's like these guys are getting nervous. They're getting a little scared. It's like we gotta create an apologetic empire and collaborate and keep the forces strong. And Apologia was actually mentioning that today on a Facebook group, and I made the comment to Apologia that more Christians leave apologetics, or because of apologetics. They leave Christianity because of apologetics than enter. In other words, apologetics, in my opinion, is a net loss for Christianity. Here's an example from this video. There are probably followers of these guys. There's some followers of these guys who listened to this video and said, you know what, I just love Jesus. I never even knew there was a problem with animal suffering until you guys brought it up. What are you talking about? There's a problem with animal suffering? And you know what's going to happen? Some of your followers are going to go, oh, I understand why there's a problem now. And Cameron even admitted that that is a formidable problem, or it's a problem. Maybe I should be worried. And that causes them to study something else. That causes them to study something else. It's the butterfly effect, right? You just look at seminaries, the number of people who leave seminary, leave Christianity because of seminary, as opposed to the other way around. Okay, I'm going to fast forward to Mike Winger summing up here. I thought there's some interesting things to talk about here.
Well,
fruit of the spirit,
okay, so
man. Fruit of the
I
spirit.
think we've given some thoughtful responses, and I want to point out, like, we're trying to understand Drew's points accurately, and while we disagree, and we even think that there are huge consequences for the kind of error that he's leading people to.
Huge consequences to the kind of error that he's leading people to. What is Mike Winger talking about? He's talking about this. He's talking about Drew being an evangelical for hell. This is what Mike Winger is saying. He's saying he's leading them to hell. Huge. What else is the huge consequence? He's just saying, like, he's going to miss out on Sunday morning brunch at church? No, he's talking about hell, heaven and hell. And this is why I often joke around when, but I'll say what these guys think. I'll just come out and say it. My goal here is to lead the youth to hell, because I know they're thinking it. So you might as well just put it out on the table.
We're trying to be charitable. We're trying to be loving. We're trying to build bridges here and not burn them. But I want to mention something, which is Drew's like journey into atheism. It sounds like someone's like washing their hands in the background. Is that? What is that?
Yeah.
Anyway,
probably John.
I won't worry. I just know none of us is going to the bathroom, so don't worry about the noises, guys. But Drew's journey into atheism, I think he's putting potentially on display for us his journey into atheism, which was.
Okay, this is amazing to me. It's like you can, if you're an atheist listening who is the next Christian, you can smell this coming from a mile away. It's like you can just tell that he just had a bad idea, a concept of who God really is, and he didn't have that real loving relationship, and he didn't understand the Bible, and he wasn't deep into the philosophical stuff like we are. If only he was like us, if only he knew what we knew, he'd be a Christian today.
Coming up with a series of tough questions pointed at Christianity, but the questions were generally maybe not thought through for very long, and they're pointed at a shallow understanding of Christian truth and sort of a paper mache version of God. And so question after question after question without answers does lead someone towards atheism. But the answers are there.
The answers are there in Christianity. You know what? The answers are there for Mormonism. The answers are there for Islam. Oh no, Doug, those are just terrible. Well, I grant that Mormonism and Islam, the historicity of it is better than Christianity. So it's easier to pick it apart. Christianity is a little tougher because it's older. But I tell you, it doesn't matter what worldview, what religion if people want to believe something strong enough, in fact, the smarter they are, the better they are at coming up with justifications and answers and reasons for what they believe, even though, like, there's lawyers and doctors who are Scientologists, is there not? There's lawyers and doctors, surgeons who are Mormons, are there not?
And if people will pursue them and will care enough, and maybe that's what Pascal's wager is saying, is like, hey, care enough to pursue those things, then I would just say, like, dear atheist, like, there's good answers to your questions. Maybe I can't answer every question.
They're good answers in your mind, in your view, but the reason why so many leave Christianity is because those answers are not sufficient for them. And at this point, you could just say, Mike, oh, okay, I understand. Those answers don't resonate with you, fine. But you can't leave it there, can you? Because there's so much at stake. There's heaven and hell, and I don't want to see you burn in hell forever. My guess is all 4 of these guys believe in eternal conscious torment. Actually, I'm getting a little worried about Cameron. I think his views are changing over the years. I wouldn't be surprised if he went from a non-common descent evolution guy to believing it now. I wouldn't be surprised if he's started out at eternal conscious torment and is now shifting on that. You better earn your money quickly, Cameron, because you might be out in 5 years or less.
But most of them we can, I think, and that's pretty significant. Christianity shows itself to be true. It's psychologically powerful to just ask question after question, but it's not intellectually wise to take pride in mere questions.
Oh, you hear that, Jesus? Jesus, are you listening? Don't take pride in only answering questions. Who do you say that I am? Questions are not arguments, Jesus.
As Cam likes to say, questions are not arguments.
Yeah, and that's where I'll end it. The ending part was kind of fun. I don't know if I should have played so much of the animal suffering stuff from John, but that's that. How long have I gone so far? Oh, it's not as long as I thought it would be. I believe in eternal conscious torment. Have you seen Cats? I'm telling you guys, it's a great idea. 2020, apologetic empire. Keep working on it. Keep collaborating. Do more videos like this. It brings me such great meaning and purpose. Make sure every time you critique an atheist, you point out that they're ignorant of the Bible and they haven't read all the philosophical stuff that you guys have. Point that out to your followers, Christian followers as well, who just love Jesus. See ya, Yuviz. Funny, Trevor. I'm already sold on Judaism, John. It's I watched Fiddler on the Roof, and that was it. You can call me a atheist Jew if you want. I'm kidding. Hey, thank you, CP Peacemakers. First time in here? Well, welcome. Hopefully you saw some of this. If you didn't, you can rewind. Yeah, look at all the books on the shelves. Look at mine. That tells you who has the more confident personality type. Doug would save you even if you didn't worship him. Yes, I would save you even if you didn't worship me. It's just the type of guy I am. Poof. My apologies to Mike Winger, John, whatever his last name is, Cameron Bertuzzi, and Braxton Hunter. They were scheduled to all 4 of them to come on and beat me up, but we ran out of time. Have a great evening, everyone. Take care. May science bless you.